Welcome back to the pursuit of progress. So, there's an idea from Ed Milet that I've heard him talk about that sounds almost too simple. You could be one decision away from a completely different life. Not 100 decisions, not some perfectly mapped out 5-year plan. Sometimes it's literally just one decision. So, think about some of the biggest changes in your own life. Maybe it's the decision to take a job, or maybe it's to leave one. Maybe to move somewhere new, start a business, maybe buy your first house. Maybe get serious about your health, make a phone call, walk away from something that just isn't working anymore. Well, you probably had no idea at the time how much that one decision would change everything that came afterward. And that is exactly what Ben and I want to talk about today. Because, I think that we sometimes overcomplicate change, and we think that we maybe need to have everything figured out before we ever start. But maybe you don't need to figure out your entire life. Maybe you just need that one decision and figure that out first. So, Ben, when you look back on your life, let's just start off with talking about, what's one decision that you made that completely changed its entire direction? And I can think of a couple just being one of your best friends, but I'd love just to hear maybe something that, if you think of anything off the top of your head, that maybe you really felt impacted your life with just that one decision.
Yeah, I have a couple of really big milestones in my life. That one decision, I have about 10 of those, but one of those was moving back to Colorado from Arizona. That happened in 2015. Another really big one for me was leaving the security of my salaried job that I had been at for over 10 years and taking on a position that was 100 commission. And I go back to that day just so, because I was on 100% commission job back in 2006. It just ended horribly because the market crashed with the great housing recession. Those were some really, really tough years. So coming out of that, I then really found value being a salaried employee. And I told myself I would never go back to a position that was commission based. And so when I reversed that decision in 2017, there was still a lot of fear. I was very intimidated, asking myself, can I do this? I kind of had to prove it to myself, but that was probably the biggest decision as far as career, financial, that has really just changed the trajectory of my entire life. Another one was my divorce, just a year later. That was another really big one. And that was kind of on the heels of going into a commission job. And so all of a sudden, less than a year later, now I go through this divorce. My ex-wife leaves the state. I'm with the kids by myself and on 100% commission job. So at that moment, I was looking over the brink and there was no plan B. And it was really up to me to sink or swim. And so kind of looking back at that, I can't believe it's been 8 or 9 years since both of those events. But in hindsight, so thankful that both of those things happened because I know God was working for my good. And even with the divorce, it's like, I can go to Angelica now and I can thank her. She realized that our values, our lifestyle, our habits, there just wasn't alignment there. And it was, even though it was very difficult for me at that time, it ended up being for the best. And I know that I'm in a much better position, much happier today than I was and I would have been. So yeah, those, and a lot of times those one decisions, whatever they are, it's going to be intimidating. It's going to be scary. They're not going to be comfortable decisions. And that's how you know. Like a lot of times you're probably going to feel like you don't want to go do that one thing. What are some things for you in your life?
Yeah, I would say the job, the career, some of that stuff. Thinking about this is probably 15 years ago, but when I first kind of made that decision to start my first business, Aspen Tan, the tanning salon business that I had for about a decade, and just thinking about how that one decision took me down a completely different path than it would have if I would have, decided to do something else, and just, how these little decisions can have a massive domino effect, and just they can change over time.
Yeah, and that's really what's interesting about some of these decisions that are truly life-changing is that they don't always feel life-changing in the moment when you're actually making them. Sometimes they surprisingly feel very ordinary. You accept an invitation, you make the phone call, you take the interview, you introduce yourself, you say yes to an opportunity. But those decisions can create additional opportunities. That person introduces you to another person that lead to another decision. And 5 or 10 years later, you look back and you realize none of this would have happened if I hadn't made that first decision. We look at where people are today and assume there must have been some perfectly designed plan. Usually there wasn't. There was just the first domino. And, I think a lot of times what really highlights that to me is, for example, the World Cup just ended last month. And I love watching athletes, and it doesn't always have to be athletics, but I just love watching either business people, athletes who are the best in the world at what they do. And as I'm watching them, like, so for the World Cup, for example, I loved watching Spain, France, Argentina. I had some teams that I followed into the US. And the whole time I just thought to myself, I wonder what each individual athlete on the team, what their story is, and what that one decision for them was. Because to get to that level, not only do you have to be incredibly talented, you have to be incredibly disciplined, you have to have the support group, you have to have all these different things. And for them to end up all we see is that finished product. We just see that person on TV. But there is an incredible story behind each individual. And so I just love thinking about that and watching that when I watch sports.
Yeah, man, the World Cup has so many cool storylines, so many lessons that we can pull from it. I think that's one of my favorite. This might be the third World Cup that I've really gotten into watching. So the last 12 years has been kind of when I first started really watching it. Man, it's just, I know this is kind of a tangent, but just how just awesome it is. So I'm excited
Yeah.
already for 4 years from now. But so kind of getting back into this though, the part that I'd like to talk about next is just how you don't really need the entire map. You don't need to have everything figured out. And I think this is also where a lot of people maybe can get stuck because we want to know exactly how everything is going to work before we're ever willing to take that first step. And I think especially with men over females, I think males are very kind of process goal oriented, task. So everything is kind of like, what's the next thing I need to do? We're very task focused. But
Hmm.
again, life just rarely works that way as far as needing everything to be figured out ahead of time. You usually get, just maybe enough information for that next step, not the next 15 or 20 steps. And I think real estate is a really good example of this because, somebody last week, for example, they reached out. They're like, "Hey, Adam, I really want to get into investing. I'd love to own a few investment properties someday." And then they start thinking about, just everything at once and it's incredibly overwhelming. Where do I find them? How do I finance them? What happens if a tenant leaves or something breaks? Just there's so many worst case scenarios and all of a sudden you've got 50 problems and you don't even have a property that you own yet. And, I think this is kind of similar to, maybe how today's decisions don't always have to be, I'm going to own 5 rental properties. Maybe instead it should be something like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find just what it takes to buy my first one. And then that's
Yeah.
something that I can also see with, regular home buyers where people spend, years just on the sidelines, assuming that they just can't buy and they don't have enough money. They don't have good enough credit. Their payment's going to be too high, but they've never actually taken action to just talk to somebody and find out, what it really takes. And sometimes that first decision in this real estate example isn't to buy the house. It's simply just to decide and to stop guessing and find out just what's possible. So I'm sure you see a lot of this too from the lending side, but I don't know. I just kind of like just to hear more about just how not making a decision is still a decision, and that's something we've talked about as well. Just kind of share with us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought this example up because I would say that me buying my first investment property in 2019, coming up on 7 years ago, fits right into this category. I knew it
Definitely.
was something that was important to me. As a matter of fact, as a teenager, I wrote down on my wall on a piece of paper. I wrote this down as a 17 or 18-year-old that I wanted to own 5 investment properties by the time that I was 30. Now, it didn't happen right on that exact timeline, but it did happen shortly after that. But the first one was in 2019. And so if I thought to myself at that time, if I knew everything ahead of time that goes into that, just kind of like you were describing, well, I'm going to need a property manager. I'm going to need to furnish the home. I'm going to need a pool guy, an HVAC guy, a handyman. Dude, absolutely overwhelming. But you're right. I made the decision first to go do it. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know. I didn't have any of the relationships even. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone in that specific city. I made the decision to buy out of market. So I had no connections, didn't know anyone, but I decided that it was something that was important to me. I found a property that had value and I pulled the trigger. And same thing that we were just talking about, pulling the trigger on that. Man, I was like sleepless at night. I couldn't sleep. I had anxiety at times. I was feeling sick. I'd never done anything like this before. I wasn't sure if I was making the right decision. And that's where like when you're having to ask yourself these questions, a lot of times it is very uncomfortable. But I was introduced to a great property manager down there. We have a relationship to this day. They manage not only all of my properties, but they have a portfolio of about 80 different properties that they manage. We have an incredible pool guy, a landscaper, a gardener. We have a trash guy. We have someone that does the handyman work. We have an electrician. I got a guy who snakes drains when the drain. I mean, we have like a person that we trust now for every single job. And that's the part of investing that people forget about. They always talk about the asset or the cash flow or the return on equity, return on cash, whatever it is. One thing I don't ever hear these influencers talk about is relationships,
Mm,
connections. Because if you're someone that's interested in investing, go find someone that's doing it already and has those connections and see if you can plug into their network. And then you don't have to go build those relationships on your own.
absolutely, man. It's crazy how important just not just you, but the team that you build around you is, especially with something like investment properties.
Yeah, and the thing for me is the flip side, and I think a lot of us forget this, is not making a decision is still a decision. So if you don't make the decision and you decide to do nothing, well, that still is a decision. We treat waiting like it's natural, but they're usually at a cost when we decide to wait. If you've hated your job for 4 or 5 years, for example, you keep saying maybe next year. Maybe next year I'm going to go look at other jobs or other opportunities. You're making a decision to stay. If you wanted to start a business for 10 years, but you're waiting for everything to be perfect, you're still making a decision. If you know you need to get healthier, but you keep saying, I'm going to start Monday, I'm going to start tomorrow, you're still making a decision. And as I mentioned, real estate is the same way. Sometimes waiting to buy is the right decision, but there's a big difference between waiting to buy because you've looked at the facts and decided it's best, and waiting because you're afraid to make the decision. One is strategy and the other is avoidance. And that's what we're talking about with all of these examples here. The perfect time probably isn't going to come. And that's one thing I see a lot of people waiting for, especially in lending. When it comes to refinances, they're always talking about the perfect time. Well, I'm waiting for interest rates to come down, waiting for property values to come down. The perfect time isn't coming. And so go do something now and get in the market, take action. Rates, prices, economy, job, the election, the market, your kids, your schedule. It's never going to be perfect. So at some point, you have to make the best decision you can with the information you have. To kind of just wrap up this final thought here, I went for a run last night with my daughter and we ran around 8 miles. And that was a really big topic of our conversation was that keys to life. One key that I don't hear a lot of people talking about is just the ability to make good decisions and have sound judgment. She was talking about an experience that she had over the weekend, and there were some poor choices with some peers of hers. And she was just talking about how that impacted her and others. And I was so proud of her for the confidence and the leadership that she displayed in not doing some of those things that her peers were doing. But it's those decisions and decisions are made from a foundation and a framework. And that's something else I never hear people talk about is that you have to have a framework for making decisions. So if you don't know what to do, ask yourself, what are my goals? What are my values? What do I believe in? And does this thing, does this person, does this opportunity, does this experience align with those things?
Man, that was very well said. I love that, man. I think kind of to follow that up, just how important, just how one decision can, we talked about this earlier, but can change how you see yourself as well. So not only is the decision making important just to, take action and go down the path and actually give yourself an opportunity to reap the rewards of whatever it is you're trying to do, but also just the kind of self-belief, the confidence, just how you change, how you see yourself from these decisions. And I think this is a concept that also doesn't really get talked about too much where, sometimes a decision doesn't just change what you do, but also changes who you believe you are. You decide you're going to maybe start exercising at the gym. Well, eventually you all of a sudden become somebody who exercises. You start maybe saving and investing money. Eventually you're going to become somebody who's intentional about, building wealth. Maybe like you're talking about earlier with Arizona and your rental properties, you buy your first rental investment property and all of a sudden you're not just somebody who talks about it. You're somebody who, actually invests. You're not just somebody that wants to invest someday. So again, you guys, you start the company. Now you're an entrepreneur. You publish maybe a video if you guys are trying to do YouTube. Now you're a creator. I think that's what this first decision is often so important because it is the hardest. And you're crossing this kind of invisible line, so to speak, between that person that you've been and also the person that you're trying to become. And I just think that is really, really important just to have that self-belief. And, I've been kind of, just to be frank with you guys, be open. I've been a little down recently with some personal stuff that's going on and have my self-confidence has been kind of low. And I've been, just looking into just how to improve some of that stuff. And one of the biggest things is exactly to this point where you build your self-confidence through taking action, but more importantly, by holding true to the promises that you make to yourself, little
Mm-hmm.
things like going to the gym every day. There might not be a instant gratification of seeing your biceps get bigger, but I guarantee if you really commit and you do this day in and day out, you're going to be building up that self-belief where you're becoming, even before maybe you look like it on the outside, you're becoming the person that works out every day. And that's what builds that self-confidence.
Yeah. And doing those things and following through to the promises that you made to yourself, doing them day in, day out, that's where that confidence comes from. And, I mean, I'll be honest, I've gotten out of my routine. I love my routine when I get into it, where I'm going to the gym, I'm getting up at the same time every day. I'm reading my devotional, I'm reading my biography, I'm checking all these boxes. But, sometimes in the summer, I'll just get off my routine. And then I've noticed that I start staying up a little bit later. I don't have that same discipline in the morning. And then all of a sudden, you don't start feeling as positive and as productive. And that self image a little bit can kind of deteriorate. And so it's just important to, look in the mirror from time to time and hold yourself accountable. And I think all of us have these moments just with that internal dialogue, asking ourselves, what am I avoiding right now? What am I not doing? And it's it's probably the most important question in this entire episode. What decision have you already basically made because you're too afraid to act on? Not something that you're genuinely unsure about, something that you know that you need to do, but you're not doing. Something you need to quit. Maybe it's something that you need to start. It's a conversation that you've been avoiding, a business you've talked about starting. Maybe it's a health change that you want to make. We all have those things in our life and we know what those are, each one of us, but are we taking action? Maybe you want to buy your first home. Maybe it's investing like we talked about. Whatever it is, ask yourself, what exactly am I waiting for?
Absolutely. Very well said. Yeah, and I think the challenge that we can kind of give everybody today that's on this episode listening or watching on YouTube, don't just ask, how do I completely change my life? That's completely overwhelming and just unrealistic. Instead, again, break it down. Just what is one decision that I can make today that moves me forward? And then take that action on that one thing in the next 24 hours. Whether that's, making the special important call that you've been putting off, sending an email, maybe scheduling an appointment, applying for a new job, talking to a lender or a realtor, just whatever it is, that first domino needs to get knocked
Approach
over.
the girl.
Approach the girl. Yeah. Just how important it is just to break it down into these very, very simple daily actions. And, some of the most successful people that I follow online and kind of look up to as mentors, one of them is Andy Frisella, who I talk about a lot. And, he's now a billionaire and he just has built his entire life off of his, what he calls power list, which is exactly this. He doesn't do one, he has five. But again, as long as you're taking these actionable steps every day, that turns into a massive result over the long run. And it just starts with these simple little things just to make one little move towards the goal that you're trying to accomplish.
You might be listening to this thinking you're years away from the life that you want, and maybe you are. Some things take years, but here's the important part. The decision that starts those years of progress could happen right now and today. And the sooner you make that decision, the sooner you can start your path forward.
Yeah. You don't have to change your entire life. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't need to know exactly where the road even ends. You just need to have enough courage to make that next decision. And someday you're going to look backward and realize that was the moment that completely changed everything. I mean, again, guys, look at the incredible stuff that Ben's been able to accomplish with some of these rental properties, just as one simple, quick example that we shared today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it could be that one phone call, the one conversation, the one application, the one workout, the one investment, the one yes, the one no, the
One
one
decision.
decision,
Yep.
the one decision.
So we'll leave you guys with this, just what's that one decision that you've been putting off that could change the entire direction of your life, and what's actually stopping you from making it? Because you might be a lot closer to your next chapter than you realize. You might just be that one decision away. Thanks again, guys, for listening to another episode of the Pursuit of Progress podcast. Keep moving forward, keep getting better, and we'll see you next time. For Benjamin Adams, I'm Adam Lang, and we'll catch you guys next time.
We love you guys. Have a great week.